The church bells tolled low, their echo swallowed by the hushed whispers of mourners. Grief weighed heavy in the air, but beneath the soft rustle of black garments and folded hands, one voice cut sharper than all the rest. Leaning close, my brother let his words drip like venom, his whisper meant for me alone. Mother loved me more, always did. Everything she left behind proves it. His smirk carried no grief, no sorrow, only triumph. While tears blurred the edges of the coffin before me, something colder settled in my chest. Not rage, not despair, something steadier, a decision carved in silence. That day, at our mother's funeral, grief turned into resolve and revenge. Quietly bloomed, while others wept, I remained still, my eyes on him. He laughed too loudly at condolences, embraced too eagerly, wore sorrow like an ill-fitting mask. And then he looked at me, lips curling in a smirk so fleeting no one else caught it. That was when silence fractured, not outside, but within. My calm stare met his, and for a moment his smile faltered, as though he recognized the storm he had just awoken. He believed himself untouchable, a master of the stage. I would let him believe it until the stage collapsed beneath his feet. His arrogance was never quiet. It leaked out in the smallest of ways. A boast to bold at a dinner table, a careless slip when speaking of money that wasn't his. He had grown used to deception, to bending truths until they bent entirely his way. But I caught every misstep. Every contradiction clung to him like cracks in polished glass. And though he believed I still played the grieving sibling, I was already sharpening suspicion into a blade. Digging through drawers left untouched since our mother's passing, I found what he had hidden away. Letters rewritten in his hand, contracts altered with forged signatures, bank records that reeked of theft disguised as inheritance. He had robbed her long before death could. The betrayal was deeper than his smug whisper at the funeral. It was years in the making, a quiet bleeding of trust and love until only greed remained. I held each document with a steady hand, the weight of proof pressing against me like a vow. Still, I smiled at him. I asked him to dinner, listened to his hollow stories, nodded at his claims of business ventures and successes. To him, I was the quiet shadow that never suspected. To me, he was the predator who didn't know he was already in a cage. I let him boast, let him dig deeper, let him believe the silence between us was surrender. And the more he preened, the more blind he became. It was pride that betrayed him, as pride always does. One evening, flushed with wine and arrogance, he bragged to a companion that he had secured everything from our mother long before her last breath. He didn't notice I stood in the doorway, unseen but listening. His tongue, so sure of its own cleverness, had written the confession I needed. That slip was his undoing, and I locked the moment away like the final piece of a puzzle. When I struck, it was quiet, precise. Bank statements delivered to the right hands, forged contracts, unmasked by experts, conversations recorded and placed where ears could not ignore them. He woke one morning to a world rearranged. The business partners he lied to no longer returned his calls. The lawyers he bought with his charm now weighed evidence heavier than his smile. He looked for me then, but I remained calm, watching. As the storm gathered over him, the unraveling came swift. One by one, his lies collapsed, each thread of deceit snapping under the weight of truth. Where he once stood smug and untouchable, he now stammered and begged. The smirk that had haunted me vanished, replaced by the dull shock of a man who never believed his downfall possible. Watching him struggle was not joy, it was justice, unfolding exactly as I had designed, stripped of wealth, reputation, and the allies who once circled him like vultures waiting for scraps. He finally looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. His voice cracked, half plea, half curse, but there was nothing left to bargain with, no mask to hide behind. For the first time, he understood the price of betrayal, and he paid it in full. Silence returned, not the suffocating silence of grief, but the stillness of balance restored. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked away, leaving him in the ruin he had built for himself. The past lay buried with my mother, but I carried something sharper than vengeance. I carried freedom. And as I stepped into a life no longer shadowed by his deceit, I understood the truest revenge of all. I had won without ever lowering myself to his level. From the earliest days of my memory, he was the golden child. My brother's smile could bend any situation in his favor, his words polished with charm, his lies cloaked in sincerity. Teachers adored him, neighbors praised him, and even our own mothers seemed to look at him with a tenderness she rarely offered me. It wasn't that she didn't love me, but he had a way of commanding the spotlight, pulling every gaze toward him as though the sun itself rose and set at his whim. I lived in his shadow, overlooked, underestimated. But shadows are patient things. They watch. They remember. The wounds he left were not born in grand betrayals, but in countless small thefts. I remember winning a competition once, my name announced, applause filling the hall. Yet by the time the story traveled through my brother's lips, it was his encouragement, his guidance, that had helped me win. The recognition shifted subtly toward him, and everyone believed it. Another time, when I painted something our mother had admired, he leaned in and whispered, "She wouldn't love it if I hadn't inspired you," and she, unaware of the poison, smiled at him as if it were true. These were the silent wounds, the kind that leave no scar on the body but slowly hollow out the soul. But the deepest cut came later, when he turned our mother herself against me. It was never direct. He planted doubts carefully, always with a tone of concern. If she misplaced something, he suggested gently that I was forgetful. If I missed a call, he hinted that I was unreliable. Piece by piece, he shifted her faith in me until her eyes carried disappointment where once there had been warmth. I became, in her mind, the child who let her down, while he stood as her unwavering support. What she never knew was that he built his pedestal from deceit. When her health began to fail, his mask became his greatest weapon. He took over her accounts, her appointments, her decisions, always with the air of a devoted son. She depended on him completely, blind to the way he exploited her weakness. She clung to him in trust, while he counted every document, every signature, every opportunity to benefit from her frailty. And I, living away, working, tangled in responsibilities, was haunted by guilt. I told myself I couldn't have known, that I couldn't have stopped it, but regret carved itself into me nonetheless. I had left her in his hands, and by the time I realized it was too late, her death should have been an ending. Yet grief, for me, was laced with unease. Something in me refused to let go. When I returned to sort through her belongings, I expected only the weight of memory. Instead, I found something she had hidden away, tucked beneath old papers, covered in dust, almost forgotten. A cassette tape. Its label was faint, the ink nearly gone, but my name was still etched there in her handwriting. I pressed play, and her voice filled the silence. Fragile but steady, she spoke of things she never said aloud, truths she could not confront while alive. She confessed doubts about my brother, how his sweetness sometimes felt rehearsed, how she had begun to suspect his motives. She admitted her regrets, her sorrow for letting distance grow between us, her wish that she had trusted her instincts. And then she said something that broke me. She had always loved me, but she had been blind to how much he twisted her against me. Hearing her voice from beyond the grave was like a hand reaching out through time, giving me not only closure but purpose. The cassette was a weapon, but I didn't wield it immediately. Timing, I knew, was everything. If I revealed it too soon, he would twist it as he had twisted everything else. He would cry manipulation, claim editing, play the victim. He would use his smile as a shield and his lies as arrows. No, I couldn't afford to hand him that chance. So I hid it. I guarded it. The tape became my secret, my silent blade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And with it, I made a vow. This was no longer just about grief. It was about justice. For every stolen victory, every poisoned whisper, every false smile, he would pay. I would dismantle the empire of lies he built brick by brick. I wouldn't rage, I wouldn't stumble, and I wouldn't warn him. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about shouting, it was about silence. A silence so precise, so deliberate, that when it broke, it would shatter everything he thought he had secured. In the weeks that followed, I wore my mask as carefully as he wore his. To the world, I was the grieving sibling, calm and quiet. I attended memorials with a composed face, spoke gently of him when others praised his devotion, let everyone believe I was swallowed by mourning. Behind that mask, however, I was watching him. Every smile, every word, every move. He still believed he was untouchable, still believed the shadow would never rise against the golden child. That was his mistake. Patience became my ally. I began gathering proof, subtle and steady, records, conversations, fragments of lies that contradicted one another. He thought I was too broken to notice, too consumed by loss to care. He underestimated the strength that silence can carry. And every day that passed, I saw more clearly the cracks forming beneath his polished exterior. Arrogance made him careless. Pride made him blind. The storm built quietly, like the slow gathering of thunder on the horizon. He laughed, he preened, he basked in sympathy, unaware that his kingdom of lies was rotting from the inside. And I, the shadow, waited with the patience of years. For the first time, I held the power he could not see, the truth sharpened into a blade he could never defend against. He thought my silence meant surrender, but silence was the storm, and when it broke, it would consume him. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin, making every sound that does emerge feel sharper, more dangerous, more deliberate. I sat at the edge of the room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan masking the quickening rhythm of my breath, though my face betrayed none of it. Calm, unreadable, the mask I had worn for so long was still intact. The funeral had ended hours ago, yet its shadow clung to me like smoke that refuses to leave a room, and I replayed every moment in my head, dissecting words, gestures, glances. I had not returned to grieve, I had returned to calculate, to watch the vultures circle and smile politely as if none of them had blood dripping from their hands. I could still hear the faint echo of my aunt's sobs mixing with the priest's voice as he spoke about peace and forgiveness, words that meant nothing to those gathered, for beneath their somber attire and hushed tones lay greed, betrayal, and secrets buried deeper than the coffin lowered into the earth. They thought I was broken, but I was listening, cataloging, remembering who whispered what, who avoided my eyes, who smirked as though the game had already been won. One of them even dared to approach me, their perfume sharp and suffocating, leaning in with a voice that dripped with feigned sympathy, yet carried the venom of someone who believed they had triumphed over me. "It must feel so lonely now," they said softly, the words cutting deeper than any blade, a reminder of how thoroughly they had dismantled everything I once had. I met their gaze, my expression steady, my lips curving into the faintest, almost imperceptible smile, one that revealed nothing and promised everything. They mistook my silence for surrender, as they always had, failing to notice the stillness of a predator biding its time. My calm unnerved them for a moment, though they quickly covered it with another hollow smile, excusing themselves to whisper in the corner with others of their kind. I sipped my glass of water, the liquid cool against my throat, a grounding reminder that patience was my greatest weapon, and tonight was only the beginning of their undoing. The rain began outside just as the last guests departed, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that seemed almost rehearsed, almost as if the night itself was conspiring with me. I stood at the window, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of gold beneath the downpour, each drop a metronome marking the passage of time, the countdown to when my hand would finally close around what they had stolen. My phone buzzed an unknown number, though I already knew who it was. A voice on the other end, calm, precise, professional, confirming that the first step had been completed. Documents had been acquired, evidence secured, names written in ink. where once they were only shadows. I thanked them quietly and ended the call, my reflection in the rain-speckled glass staring back at me, eyes colder than I remembered them ever being. The grief that had once softened me now stripped away, leaving only resolve. In the distance, thunder rumbled low, a sound not of warning but of agreement, and I felt the weight of inevitability settle into my bones. They believed they had silenced me, cornered me, buried me beneath loss, but they had only sharpened me, carved away hesitation until all that remained was focus. Later, in the quiet of the night, I replayed their words again and again, the smirks, the whispered insults, the deliberate exclusion, the arrogance with which they moved, convinced they had orchestrated my downfall perfectly. But what they could not see, what they would never see until it was too late, was that every look, every sentence, every betrayal had been turned into a blade that I now carried with precision. Revenge is not loud, I reminded myself. It is not rushed, nor messy, nor clumsy. It is a hand that moves quietly in the dark, rearranging the pieces until the board belongs to you again. It is the smile you give to someone as they unknowingly walk into the trap you set. It is patience stretched, so thin it becomes steel. And so, I moved my pieces unseen. A lawyer who owed me a favor here, a banker with loose lips there, a quiet meeting arranged under the guise of condolence but laced with questions that seemed harmless yet revealed more than they realized. Every thread I pulled unraveled more of their carefully woven lies, and soon their empire of deceit began to tremble. And yet I was careful. Too much too soon, and suspicion would rise. Too little, and they would grow bold. So I let them laugh, let them believe, let them sit comfortably in their illusion of control while beneath their feet, I shifted the ground inch by inch. At dinner tables, their names were spoken with respect, but I was planting seeds of doubt. In boardrooms, their signatures commanded authority, but I was already ensuring those documents held traps they could not escape. Each move was deliberate, each strike invisible until it was too late to block. And though the nights were long and heavy, I carried them with an ease that only comes when you know victory is inevitable, when you feel the tide changing. Though the shore still appears calm, then came the moment I had waited for, not loud, not dramatic, but subtle, precise, like the flick of a blade through silk. One of them received a notice, another a call they could not ignore, and suddenly the whispers began not about me but about them. Accusations, suspicions, the very poison they had once dripped into my life now flowing freely through theirs. I did not raise my voice, I did not reveal my hand. I simply watched as the cracks they had created widened into chasms that swallowed them whole. And when one of them finally confronted me, desperate, furious, demanding to know what I had done, I looked at them the way I had looked that night at the funeral, calm, steady, unflinching, and said nothing. Because silence, I had learned, is louder than any confession. They had taken everything from me, but in their arrogance, they had given me something greater, the power to dismantle them piece by piece without ever raising a finger in anger. And as I walked away, leaving them in the ruins they had built for themselves, I felt the rain again, soft against my skin, not like mourning this time, but like renewal. The storm had passed, and in its wake, justice had finally settled, not as an explosion, but as a quiet inevitability. They had believed they were untouchable, but fate, as always, sides with patience, with silence, with those who wait in the shadows until the time is right. And so I left with no need for gloating, no need for words, only the quiet satisfaction that comes when karma moves through you like a current, steady, unstoppable. An absolute. It began with greed disguised as opportunity, a hand reaching where it never should have gone. My brother, the man who had once stood beside me through the turbulence of childhood, crossed a line that could not be erased. The family property, our inheritance, a legacy meant to bind us together, was quietly siphoned into his name through fraudulent signatures and whispered deals in the shadows. He thought no one would notice, that his charm and carefully built reputation would shield him from scrutiny, but I noticed. And though anger stirred beneath the surface, I gave it no voice. Rage was his weapon. Patience was mine. I watched, and in that silence, my resolve hardened. The first crack in his armor came not in private, but in front of the entire family. At the long dining table, where portraits of ancestors stared down at us with solemn eyes, he found amusement in my restraint. He ridiculed me openly, laughing at imagined failures, spinning stories of my supposed incompetence to an audience that chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to side with him or remain silent. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I met his words with an expression so calm it unsettled even him, though he masked it with louder laughter. What he mistook for weakness was calculation. In that room of relatives, while he painted himself as untouchable, he didn't realize he was already sealing his fate, but arrogance has a way of eroding the mask of perfection. Soon, whispers began threading through the family, doubts creeping into conversations spoken just out of earshot. They began to notice the sharpness in his tone, the dismissive gestures, the way his charm seemed forced rather than natural. The golden mask that had dazzled so many was beginning to crack, and through those cracks seeped the truth of who he really was. I fed none of these doubts openly. I simply observed, letting his arrogance do what it always does, expose itself. Then came the debts. Like shadows creeping in at dusk, they revealed themselves slowly, at first a missed payment here, a desperate phone call there. But soon the picture became clearer. His empire, built on borrowed money and reckless investments, was beginning to crumble. I followed the trail quietly, piecing together ledgers, emails, and hidden agreements. His wealth was not wealth at all, but a fragile illusion balanced on rotting beams. And though he fought to maintain appearances, every day left him more exposed, more vulnerable. It was then that I began my subtle work. At first, it was only a quiet word dropped in confidence, a document casually left where the right eyes might see, a hint of truth veiled in uncertainty. I needed to know who I could trust within the family, who would cling to him out of loyalty and who would recoil when the truth drew near. Slowly, carefully, I drew the map of alliances, testing every bond, ensuring that when the moment came, the witnesses would be undeniable. Patience was my ally. Though I held enough evidence to destroy him outright, I chose restraint. I let him grow bold again, allowed him to bask in his hollow victories, drowning in the illusion of invincibility. Every mocking smile he threw my way only deepened the trap I was setting. He believed I had no power left, that silence meant defeat. In truth, silence was the final sharpening of the blade. The opportunity came wrapped in the guise of remembrance. A memorial gathering for our mother, cloaked in reverence and nostalgia, provided the perfect stage. Every detail was arranged with precision, the guest list carefully chosen, the timing exact, the atmosphere solemn enough to draw out the truth like confession. It appeared to be a tribute, but beneath the flowers and eulogies lay the framework of his downfall. He arrived dressed in smugness, every gesture dripping with the confidence of a man convinced the night belonged to him. He shook hands, made toasts, basked in the admiration of those who still clung to his performance. He never once looked at me with suspicion. Why would he? In his mind, I had been reduced to silence long ago. That blindness was his undoing. As the evening unfolded, a quiet stillness began to grow. Eyes turned not toward him with admiration but with unease. The documents I had placed in careful hands were now circulating in whispers, questions forming where once there had only been applause. And though he continued to play his role, he did not notice that every guest was no longer an ally but a witness. The noose, invisible yet undeniable, was tightening with each passing moment. By the time he rose to speak, believing it was yet another chance to remind everyone of his supposed greatness, the stage was no longer his. The silence that met his words was not reverence but judgment, a collective awareness dawning in the room. He mistook it for awe, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath him had already vanished. He walked straight into his ruin, oblivious until the last moment. One by one, the questions began measured, precise, impossible to deflect. Accusations layered over evidence, witnesses confirming what I had only hinted at before. His empire, his reputation, his carefully crafted identity collapsed not with a shout, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of undeniable truth. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply watched as he unraveled. A man who had believed himself untouchable now reduced to silence before those who once adored him, and when it was done, when the dust of his collapse settled and his empire lay in ruins, I stood with the quiet strength of someone who had not only survived but triumphed. The family property was restored, his debts laid bare, his legacy stripped of illusion. I had no need to humiliate him further. His own actions had done that better than I ever could. Victory did not come in the form of laughter or mockery. It came in silence, in the weight of justice delivered without theatrics. As I left that night, I carried with me not the bitterness of revenge but the clarity of renewal. His ruin was complete, not by force, but by inevitability. Success was the sharpest revenge, and mine was carved into permanence. I had outlasted him, outplayed him, and in the end, I walked away untouchable. The house was dressed in solemn black, candles flickering against portraits of the woman who had once held them all together. Family gathered beneath the roof in the name of remembrance, carrying the weight of tradition like a cloak, their hushed words and downcast eyes forming a performance of grief. Yet beneath the polite condolences, there was an unspoken tension, a fracture they refused to name. I stood quietly among them, the dutiful child, my expression calm, respectful, untouchable. No one could see that beneath the surface, every word I spoke and every glance I cast was sharpened with purpose. Tonight was not about mourning, it was about unveiling the truth they had chosen to ignore. The center of it all was my brother, basking in the light of admiration as though the night existed only for him. He wore his grief like a costume, moving from relative to relative, gathering their sympathy, their nods, their smiles. His voice carried across the room, confident, polished, every word crafted to reinforce the role he had always claimed, the golden child, our mother's pride. He spoke of sacrifices he never made, of loyalty he never gave, weaving himself once again into the image of the perfect son. Mother always trusted me most, he boasted, raising his glass as if delivering a toast to himself, the smirk at the corner of his mouth betraying his triumph. The others nodded, some half-heartedly, some with hesitation, but none dared challenge the myth he had built. I watched him carefully, my silence louder than his words. He mistook it for surrender, for the meek obedience I had worn for years. He did not see the pause that stretched longer than usual when I finally rose to my feet, nor the weight in my gaze as it swept across the room. Something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a ripple in the air that silenced whispers and drew all eyes to me. For the first time that evening, his laughter faltered, then, without preamble, the sound of our mother's voice filled the room. The recording had been hidden for years, guarded with the same care one protects a blade meant for a single strike. Her voice trembled at first, aged and worn, but grew steadier with every word. She spoke of her love, yes, but also her fears, her disappointments, and the betrayal she could no longer ignore. She confessed how he had manipulated her, pressured her into signing away property, siphoning money under the guise of care. She revealed his cruelty behind closed doors, the mask he wore for others, the selfishness that had poisoned their bond. Each syllable was heavy with truth, undeniable, unalterable. I did not look at him while it played. I looked at them, the aunts and uncles, the cousins and family friends, every witness who had once believed his polished lies. Their faces told the story better than words could. Shock rippled through the crowd, whispers replaced with gasps, admiration with disgust. When the voice of the woman they had gathered to honor ended in quiet despair, silence crushed the room. And in that silence, his mask cracked. He laughed at first, brittle and forced, waving a dismissive hand. This is nonsense. Fabricated. She was ill, confused. She didn't know what she was saying. His words stumbled against the weight of proof, growing sharper as desperation seeped in. He pointed at me, spitting venom, calling me manipulative, bitter, envious. But no amount of accusation could erase the echo of our mother's voice, trembling yet resolute, etched into their ears. The smirk he wore so proudly, the confidence he wielded like armor, dissolved with every denial. For years, his charm had been his weapon. He had twisted it into a shield against accountability, using it to bend the truth, to blind those too willing to believe. But here, under the weight of evidence he could not spin, it turned to dust in his hands. His once loyal audience no longer smiled. Their eyes were cold, their judgment unspoken but clear. Every trick he had relied on had failed him. He turned to me then, and for the first time in our lives, his arrogance was gone. His voice cracked as he spoke, his words stripped of confidence. Please, you don't understand. I did it for the family, for her. Don't do this. He reached for sympathy, for the last fragments of control, but none came. The silence of the room, the stillness of their eyes, was his verdict, and so the brother who had mocked, stolen, and deceived now stood cornered, his empire of lies collapsing in the place he thought safest among family. His laughter had been silenced, his mask torn apart, his power shattered not by anger or force, but by truth spoken from beyond the grave. I did not gloat, nor did I speak a word of triumph. I simply stood, calm and composed, as he begged for the mercy he had never given. The storm I had carried in silence was finally released, not in rage but in revelation. The justice I had waited for was delivered not by my hand alone, but by the voice of the woman he had betrayed. And as the night drew to its end, I left him there among the ashes of his own making, knowing that his ruin was complete. The house that had once echoed with his laughter now rang only with his pleas. But I did not turn back. My revenge was not in his suffering, but in the truth finally set free. And in that truth, I found my own beginning. They stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. The smirk that had so often disarmed them now seemed grotesque, a mask, slipping from a face they no longer recognized. Murmurs rose, but not in his favor. The same aunts who once adored him turned their eyes away. The cousins who followed his laughter shifted uneasily, and even the uncles who had trusted his every word stood stiff with betrayal. It was no longer my accusation he faced, it was hers, our mother's voice echoing from the grave, undeniable and irreversible. When he reached for their sympathy, they recoiled, the weight of his lies finally collapsing under truth too sharp to ignore. In that silence, his empire of charm crumbled, leaving him isolated in a room where he had once been adored. The final blow came not from whispers but from the law. The lawyer rose with a quiet authority, his tone firm, deliberate, the kind that left no room for doubt. He spoke of wills, of documents signed under duress, of assets shifted with manipulative hands. The recording, authenticated and clear, was more than confession, it was evidence. My brother's boasts, once loud and unchecked, now stood as proof of guilt. In a matter of moments, the inheritance he had claimed as his rightful throne slipped from his grasp. The lawyer's words etched the verdict in stone. What was stolen would be returned, what was twisted would be corrected. And while he sputtered protests, clutching at the air as though it could catch his falling kingdom, the truth sealed his fate. That night marked the beginning of his unraveling. With the inheritance gone, his debts surfaced, each more damning than the last. Creditors circled like vultures, lawsuits crawled from shadows, and the fought of wealth he had paraded before others collapsed in full view. Every fraudulent deal, every forged signature, every hollow investment came clawing back, stripping him of status, stripping him of allies. The family, once charmed into blindness, now whispered of police investigations, of bankruptcy, of disgrace. His name, once spoken with admiration, was now a curse, an example of arrogance punished. I did not raise a hand to destroy him. His own lies pulled him apart, thread by thread, and I watched, silent. I did not gloat, nor did I remind him of his cruelty. There was no satisfaction in shouting, no need to humiliate him further. Revenge, I had learned, was sharpest when delivered in stillness. My calm unnerved him more than fury ever could. As his world burned, I stood at the edges, unscathed, the quiet victor in a war he thought he had already won. The irony was not lost on either of us. While he craved recognition, my silence spoke louder than any triumphal cry. In time, desperation replaced arrogance. He clawed at fading opportunities, begged those he had once deceived, pleaded for second chances. None came. His life became a cage of his own making, the walls built from greed, the bars forged from betrayal. He fought against it, thrashing in denial, blaming me, blaming fate, blaming anyone but himself. Yet no matter how fiercely he struggled, the truth held him captive. The empire he built on deception had become his prison, and I did not need to lock the door he had sealed it himself. When the noise of his downfall finally dimmed, I found myself standing by the grave of the woman whose voice had set it all in motion. The earth was still fresh, the stone unmarked by years, and the flowers lay where trembling hands had left them. I spoke softly, not for her forgiveness, but for her peace. You loved us both, I whispered, letting the words settle into the quiet air, but only one of us listened. It was not triumph I carried to her, but closure. She had been silenced in life, but in death her truth had spoken, and I had honored it. And so the story ended, not in fire or fury, but in stillness. Revenge had not been my weapon. Patience had. I had waited, watched, and when the time came, I let his own lies consume him. There was no need for rage when truth itself was sharper than any blade. His downfall was not my destruction of him, it was his own. And in that final silence, I understood the truth of it all. Revenge is not about noise, nor about spectacle. It is about waiting until the moment when the enemy's hand trembles, and then revealing the mirror they can no longer bear to face. That was the justice delivered, and it was enough.